are symbolized by a crest depicting a wide expanse of green fields stretching out into the distance for their agrarian culture and strong work ethic, a rising sun and a setting moon for the transition of the region from Islam to Christianity, a fortress for the war which made these lands available to them, whose 6 towers represent the 6 major regions settled by these people. Above, the river which brought them to their homeland and which gave them their name. Watching over it all, the eagle of the German imperial crest for the emperor's responsibility to them and for their German roots. Who are these people? And what happened to them? The Donauschwaben once comprised the largest group of ethnic Germans in southeastern Europe, numbering approximately 1.5 million before World War II. However, their origins lie far earlier than that. In the early 18th century, after the Habsburg Empire defeated the Ottoman Turks, many Germans were commanded by Kaiser Franz Joseph to settle the lands left barren by the war. They follow the Danube River to their new home.
So, Kaiser Franz Joseph, if you know what I'm talking about, he said to some people, to whoever wanted it, go over there. I gave everybody so much land, and you can settle down there. So a lot of them did, and they left. It was called the Ulmer Schachtel, which they put together a wooden box, and so many people would fit in there and went and the Daniel till they landed wherever they wanted to.
In 1723, many German settlers began in earnest to settle the Hungarian basin. They came from homelands and regions throughout modern-day Germany, particularly from the city of for which their boats were named. These settlers became known as Danube Swabians, or Donauschwaben. As they began to settle the land along the Danube, the Donauschwaben found that the land was harsh and difficult to farm, but they were determined and persevered.
But that was very bad land. It was like a jungle, so to speak, and those people had absolutely nothing to work with. They made all their stuff, whatever they found. There is not another nation, another country as hard-working people as the Donauschwaben. Like the saying was, you can take everything away today from the Donauschwabe. Tomorrow he has it back, because they were very, very ambitious.
The Donauschwaben prospered despite the early challenges, developing a unique culture combining their German heritage with that of others who settled that region. They have maintained many of their traditions for hundreds of years. Their sense of community was strong, and each village enjoyed celebrating festivals each year, filled with music, dancing, and delicious food. The biggest festival of the year was Kirve Fest.
Kirve, or Kirve Fest, Festival of the Consecration of the Church, was a big celebration on the last Sunday in October. It was the biggest thing aside from weddings. The week before, in preparation for the event, the house was cleaned and freshly painted, inside and out. Besides that, all the food preparations had to be done for the event. It was called Crazy Week. On Saturday night, the celebration got started by shooting blanks and ringing bells. Each of the pubs would plant a Kirve bomb outside their establishment. This was a little tree decorated with colorful ribbons and bottles. Then the pub owner would dig up the buried Kirve from last year. This was usually a wine bottle hidden under a loose board in the pub. After this was consumed or poured out, depending on how well the wine kept, the dancing began. On Sunday morning, everybody in town and tourists would go to church. The celebration really got underway after lunch. Vendors brought in their wares of candies and ice cream for the kids. The children could also ride a carousel at times. The men bowled or just sat around and sipped wine in the company of their wives. The young folks would dance, of course, till 3 in the morning. On Monday afternoon, the celebration continued with dancing, and at the end of the evening, newly filled bottles got buried again until next year.
As years went by, other ethnic groups settled the land along the Danube where the Donauschwaben had first settled. And for many years, the many groups lived in peace and friendship, sharing aspects both of culture and language.
Im Haus haben wir Deutsch gesprochen, auf der Straße.
In the house we spoke German. On the street we spoke Serbian. We lived in a Serbian village, right? However, ethnic tensions rose following World War I. The Balkan states were partitioned into a number of smaller states. This was especially hard for the Donauschwaben. The borders were drawn such that this ethnic group, although large, did not constitute a majority in any of the new countries. These new borders caused tension to rise between the Donauschwaben, other ethnic Germans, and other groups living in the newly created countries.
In the case of Poland, for instance, the violations of the Minorities Treaty of 28 July 1919 are documented in several thousand petitions which were submitted to the League of Nations in the years 1919 to 1934. There were two areas of frequent conflict between the German minorities and Polish authorities, one being the question of obtaining Polish citizenship, and the other the widespread confiscation of German farms and eviction of the German owners through discriminatory Polish legislation. A typical eviction case came before the Permanent Court of Justice in The Hague, which on 10 September 1923 delivered an advisory opinion on the merits. The court unanimously held, quote, that the measures complained of were a virtual annulment of legal rights possessed by the farmers under their contracts, and being directed, in fact, against a minority and subjecting it to discriminating and injurious treatment to which other citizens holding contracts of sale or lease were not subject, were a breach of Poland's obligations under the Minorities Treaty. This sort of case frequently reappeared in court and in other petitions submitted to the League of Nations through the year 1934, when the Polish government finally repudiated the League's minority system.
Much of this discrimination and enmity came ostensibly as the result of disloyalty on the part of those ethnic minorities who were now within the borders of new host countries. Still, there is little evidence that such widespread disloyalty actually existed. The Donauschwaben had been living in these regions for hundreds of years at this point and were well entrenched in local culture. The Engelman family lived in the village of Neudorf in Yugoslavia, now called Bakonovo Selo, in modern-day Serbia.
Between the two wars, things got no better for our Donauschwaben people. The enmity which the Croats and Serbs had for each other took a back seat to the AntiGerman Hate campaign that surfaced in the 20s and 30s. The writing was on the wall. Taxes for our people were doubled in every German community, in contrast to those of the Slavs and Hungarians. Complaining at the county seat or at the capital Belgrade got our disgruntled citizens nowhere. Instead, it was looked upon as an affront to the state and brought about warnings and reprimands. Our lone representative at the state level was scoffed at when he brought up these complaints from our people. So we had to endure, and we still prospered. Security for our people slackened greatly in comparison to pre-World War I levels because thievery by the Slavs increased dramatically, as these aforementioned now raided our countryside, especially during harvest time. Complaints about the thefts of fruits, grapes, corn, or wheat from individuals' fields and orchards fell on deaf ears, even when the individuals or gangs were caught. Our policemen would arrest the thieves, but the central authorities in the big city, consisting of all Slavs, would set them free without punishment or remuneration for the robbed farmers.
These rising tensions would soon erupt into a burst of hate for the Donauschwaben and other ethnic Germans, as the Second World War led to an explosion of widespread anti-German sentiment. In early 1945, the Allies met at Yalta for a preliminary conference to determine what should be done with the millions of persons displaced by World War II. At this conference, many important decisions were made that would impact the Donauschwaben's fate. The most important was condoning certain governments' choices to expel ethnic Germans who had lived within their countries and had for generations.
In the early spring months of 1945, as the war approached its conclusion, millions of German civilians from Pomerania, Silesia, and East Prussia filled the roads to the west in their desperate flight from the fury of the conquering Soviet army. Millions, however, had remained behind, and it was at this time that the actual expulsions got underway, beginning as soon as Polish authorities moved into the occupied German provinces. Who authorized these expulsions? Did the Allied decisions at Yalta provide legal justification for the physical removal of Germans from territories subject to belligerent occupation? The fact is that these early expulsions were carried out with the encouragement of the Soviet government, but without the knowledge or authorization of the Western Allies. Of course, the leaders of Great Britain and the United States had already endorsed the principle of population transfers as applied to the Germans, and in this sense they do not escape a share of the responsibility for the excesses that accompanied the actual implementation of the principle. Yet, their endorsement had been a limited one, which the governments of Poland and later Czechoslovakia chose to interpret as a green light for indiscriminate expulsions.
By the summer of 1945, the forces led by the German Nazis had been defeated, but the anti-German sentiment was still running high. In July 1945, the victorious Allies met for the Potsdam Conference. It was there that they signed the Potsdam Agreement, authorizing the orderly and humane expulsion of millions of ethnic Germans from their homes outside of Germany. This decision was based solely on the German ancestry of these people, despite the fact that they had not lived in Germany for generations. Although the Potsdam Agreement specified that the expulsion of the Donauschwaben be orderly and humane, and although there was a lack of strong justification for the expulsion, the ethnic cleansing of the Donauschwaben in the 1940s was a brutal one. It was undertaken by a number of groups, most notably Tito's partisans. Tito, whose given name was Josip Broz, became the Secretary General of the Communist Party of Yugoslavia in 1937. In the summer of 1941, his forces began attacking the German occupying forces in Yugoslavia and seized control of the country.
Before World War II, well over 18 million Germans lived in what was generally referred to as Eastern Europe during the Cold War. That is, in East Prussia, Pomerania, the eastern part of Brandenburg, Silesia, the Free City of Danzig, as well as in territories outside the then German Reich, in Czechoslovakia, notably in the Sudetenland, in the Baltic states, in interwar Poland, Hungary, Romania, Yugoslavia, and in parts of the Soviet Union. Beginning in the late summer months of 1944, of those who had survived the war up until then, more than 14 million were expelled. Between the end of 1944 and 1948, about 2 million were killed or died of starvation or suicide. And even though no reliable figures exist, there is a basic consensus that the overall number of those who perished was in the neighborhood of 2 million.
The numbers given refer to all ethnic Germans living in these regions, not just the Donauschwaben. The reasons for the ethnic cleansing were many. However, despite the fact that the Donauschwaben and other German-speaking ethnic groups in the area had nothing to do with the Nazis and had not lived in Germany for generations, the most common justification given is that the expulsion was an act of revenge against the Germans due to the atrocities of the Nazis. For Tito and his partisans, the expulsion also served to reinforce their power, and since it also involved the seizure of lands vacated by the expellees, it provided them with the means to establish the system of government-owned land central to establishing a communist system. Piece by piece, the partisans took over Yugoslavia and the Donauschwaben villages therein. Those ethnic Germans who were unable to flee before the partisans arrived in their villages could expect one of three fates. They would be transported to camps in Yugoslavia, sent by train to serve as slave laborers in Russia, or else they would die or be executed en route to those locations. Anna Koenig was 8 years old and living in a small village in Yugoslavia, the same village in which her family had been living for almost 200 years when she and her family were forced to flee.
We had to leave our homeland, our hometown, because the communism, after the war stopped, we Germans that were still there, they wanted to kill us. We had to leave. And so we went on horse and buggy. My aunt with 2 children, my mom with 4 children, and my grandmother and my aunt and my mom on one wagon, whatever we could put on, a covered wagon, and left. So did everybody else. Whoever didn't have horses in a buggy, they were shipped by train. And they went to East, what was used to be East Germany. They took them over there, and we traveled through Hungary and into Austria. And the Austrian people had to take us in because we were homeless, okay? So they took us in, and at a farm in 9 months into that, while we were living there, the Russians came by and said to us, "Go back home. Everything is okay back home." And that's all what my grandmother wanted to hear. Everything is fine. So they took us in a wagon, a flat wagon, put us on there, and we traveled back home from Austria to Yugoslavia. So as we came to the border of Austria and Yugoslavia, they took everything away but what we had on and put us in concentration camp for 3.5 years. And then we went from one camp to the other.
We were chased out. We didn't have no choice. So the Russian came and they wanted everybody that was German out of Yugoslavia, because most of the people, a lot of the people were Croatian, and they were allowed to stay, but the Germans all had to leave, just leave. The whole families, you couldn't take nothing along, or you could a little bit, but not very much.
Anna Stagel was 5 years old when she and her family fled.
Like that?
Yeah. We went to Hamburg, and there we had to stay in the thing. And from there we went to Schlesien again. They pushed us. Nobody wanted us, So we were pushed kind of from one end to another. And
The Donauschwaben people, the Germans didn't want anything to do with them. Even though they were German people,
right.
They looked at them as like gypsies, and we don't want.
Yeah.
They didn't. They had enough problems on their own, and they didn't really want to have anything to do with it. So even now, there's still repercussions because of that. That they didn't want anything to do with them.
That's where we were in Germany, in Sachsenheim, and I remember that real well. So, and my dad wasn't with us. He was working for the railroads. And he came back and he said that they said that we can go back home. And there were so many of the families that were by us around there that they did go home, and they gave us a train, each a thing to go home. And my dad said, no, we're going to stay. No, I think my mom was the one that said, no, we're going to stay here. I don't think that's a good time to go home now. And we stayed, and all those people that left in that train, they got killed.
Well, you heard Mrs. Koenig's situation, where she went back, her family went back, and they got thrown in the camps.
3 months old when my folks had to flee, a few days before, because they knew something. Well, the German army was in there, in Hungary already, and they told the people, and it was a small town, they told the people that the Russians were coming. Basically, we were fleeing from the Russians. And they said they would be there in a matter of days, and that's when my mom and family, my grandfather, he died in the war. He was missing in action, so we never knew what happened there. And they fled then with just a few belongings. And then they got separated, family members got separated on the way, but then they reunited. So, and they settled in Bavaria then on a farm. A farmer took us in.
On November 24th, 1944, Tito's government, whom the Allies had put in charge, declared the Germans enemies of the people and stripped us all of our civic rights, which included ownership of personal property. This was the beginning of the end for the German people in Yugoslavia. On December 8th, 1944, my grandfather, Opa, and close to 400 other men were ordered to pack up and report to a work camp. As they assembled in the square, guards patrolled them. If one of the guards saw a nice pair of shoes or a jacket that he liked, the owner had to give it to the guard. If anyone refused, they simply shot him right then and there and took the article. When all were accounted for, the men marched out of the village. Somebody got really brave and rang the church bells as the first group of people left our village. They did not know that they were leaving their homes forever, and some of them would never see their families again. The men, who were between the ages of 15 and 60 years old were told that they were going to a work camp, which was about 12 miles away. Later we found out that when they got to the next town, a doctor checked them over to see if they were able to work. Those who were considered unable to work by the doctor were taken into the woods and shot. No graves were dug. The rest of the group went on to another town called Muramarak, where they worked in the woods, chopping and hauling firewood. When there was no more work in the woods, the men were moved to a town called Kuven. In the spring of 1945, this camp was dissolved and some of the men were transferred to a town called Werschitz. Others went to Srem, which was another region in Yugoslavia. My grandfather and a few others went to a town called Mitrovic. The unluckiest ones were those who were shipped to Russia to their labor camp. Mr. Grauer, a baker by trade from Fansfeld, went with Opa to Mitrovic. He told us later that Opa was put in charge of some of the men. When things came up messy, Opa was supposed to find the thief and hand him over. When Opa did not turn anybody in, he was put in isolation and never returned to camp. He died in isolation on December 3rd, 1946, at the age of 60.
A number of camps were formed throughout Yugoslavia, many built simply by fencing in Donauschwaben villages with barbed wire and erecting guard towers. And although there was some variation in occupants and purpose, the conditions of overcrowding, insufficient food, and cruelty were constant throughout.
Everybody has a different situation, but my situation was so we came from one to the other. Sometimes we had to walk. Sometimes they put us on a train and went and were there for 7-8 months, and then again someplace else.
When the partisans came in, I was too young to know what was going on. And the first camp we were in was Yarek, and I remember nothing because I was too young, didn't know anything. And furthest back experience was in the third camp. Second camp was vague.
So the last camp that we were in, a lot of people died, and we were very lucky that none of my family died. We were the first, we were all in barracks on wooden floor, wooden bunk beds, just a cover, nothing else, just a plain wood. And we were full of lice. We were undernourished. We didn't get much food. In the mornings, we might have gotten lukewarm water. And what they tried to do, not kill us by gun, but kill us by starvation. And a lot of people got sick, were very ill, so was I. I had every sickness you can imagine. I had typhus, I had cholera, I had everything what a person gets when you don't have nourishment.
Some of the Donauschwaben captured by the partisans faced another fate. Instead of being taken to camps within Yugoslavia, some ethnic Germans were shipped to Russia as slave labor. According to the Danube Swabian Association of the USA, in 1944, Stalin demanded ethnic German slave laborers from the governments of Hungary and Romania. The DSA cites the number of Donauschwaben sent to work in mines and other industrial regions of Russia at 12,000, 8,000 women and 4,000 men. In his book, Frank Engelman tells the story of his aunt, Johanna, who was one of those sent to Russia. She was luckier than most.
Most of the men from our village had been taken by the partisans at Christmas in 1944, but the women did not have long to wait for their ordeal. On December 28th came an announcement from the new community commander, a partisan lackey, directing the women to assemble in the city hall for a 2-week-long work detail. This caused a big outcry, especially among the mothers with little children, but to no avail. Altogether, there were 72 women and girls ages 18 to 30 and 3 underage teens. They were forced to march over 100 kilometers to a village named Kula, which served as a collection point for German women from other villages in the state of Bachka. Thousands were ripped from their homes, families, and even from the arms of their crying children. Those who were found to be sick, pregnant, or underage were lucky. They were sent back. On January 1st, 1945, the whole lot were stuffed into railroad cattle cars, which were without toilets or even straw to lie down on. All the passengers had assumed that it would only be a one-day trip. However, the train kept going through Hungary and Romania towards Russia. After 10 days in the freezing, stinking wagons, they had to change trains since the Russian track system was not compatible with the Austro-Hungarian one. There were many tears shed for the loved ones left behind, and fear was on every woman's face, fear of the uncertainty that lay before them. Auntie had to leave her 5-year-old son behind and worried about her husband, whose whereabouts were unknown. She clung to the hope of seeing her son again because Oma, her mother-in-law, had promised to look after the boy. Finally, on January 20th, they arrived at the railroad depot Toshkova, a mining complex. There, all the prisoners were searched again so no contraband would be brought in. Names were read off the list, and each civilian was checked off, followed by endless questions and endless standing at attention. The inquiries about party affiliation and military service of relatives were intended to expose fervor for the German cause, but with little result, since most of our people were simple farmers who wanted no part in the war. Auntie told the interrogator that her husband and his brother, my father, had been made prisoners of war by the Germans after the takeover because both of them had been drafted into the Yugoslav army just before 1940. What Auntie neglected to tell them, though, was that her brother, who was only 15, had been kidnapped by the German army during the retreat and pressed into service. Those, however, who admitted having relatives that served in the German armed forces were separated from the rest and put in a special barrack. They were dealt with much harsher. All prisoners had been delivered as presents to Stalin for his help in aiding the Yugoslavs during the war. The new inmates had to sit around at first, awaiting their daily interrogations, while the veterans toiled away in the mines.
Johanna was both very smart and very lucky. She managed to convince the interrogator that she had been a cook for a royal house, even though she had not been, and was thus able to gain an important position.
With her extensive training as she grew up, Auntie was able to whip up a tasty soup out of nothing. She passed muster and was then named the commandant's private cook.
Johanna was able to use her skills with cooking and language, as well as her cleverness, to gain better conditions for her fellow Donauschwabens, and to eventually engineer her own escape. However, most of the others sent to Russia were not so lucky. With such widespread hardship and suffering, it seems strange that no one should know about it. That after all this time and everything that happened, the general public remains ignorant of its very existence. It seems unlikely that these expulsions should remain out of common knowledge merely by accident. Indeed, this does not seem to have been the case. Rather, the ignorance is the result of the combined efforts of many who hoped to forget or escape the truth. Frank Engelmann's grandfather was put on burial duty in one of the camps, and he detailed one way in which the mass executions were covered up.
Opa explained the burial methods to me as follows. It was real slave work to excavate the ditches, especially when the ground was frozen. He and the other undernourished laborers had to excavate holes that measured about 12 feet wide, 30 to 50 feet long, and 6 to 9 feet deep, depending a lot on the consistency of the substrata. As soon as one cavernous hole had been completed, the workers moved to a new site, adjoining the completed one. The dead were laid out in double rows, so that their heads touched and their feet extended away from the center. Up to 100 bodies were accommodated in each ditch, sometimes more. On top of the first layer of bodies came a layer of lime, then a foot of dirt, followed by another row of deceased, laid out identically as the first layer. Opa commented to us that the digging could continue ad infinitum due to the fact that nothing lay on this flat plain between the graves and Hungary many miles away. Some months later, after the mounds of dirt had settled over the top of the graves and lay even with the surrounding earth, Opa was ordered to plow over the sacred ground and plant winter wheat in the fall and winter and corn in the spring, so there would be no trace of the murderous deeds perpetrated on our people. There were no prayers said by a priest, no blessing of the bodies or of the ground that swallowed them. The corpses became just inanimate objects, to be hidden from the eyes of the living. And Opus swore that those souls were doomed to roam the earth because their final resting places had not been blessed, but that their cries would reach heaven with pleas for justice.
Furthermore, additional measures were taken to conceal the partisans' campaign against the ethnic Germans of Yugoslavia.
Cameras were always the first thing confiscated when our villages were attacked and taken over, so there would be no photographic evidence of the crimes against our people. If there is any evidence in that respect, it is well hidden or destroyed.
Through the systematic prevention of evidence, along with the concealing of the victims' very graves, the partisans succeeded in keeping this ethnic cleansing out of the public eye of the world.
There was no pictures taking. There's absolutely nothing showing what we went through.
We can imagine the walls, the barbed wire, the guard towers. But without photographs to etch these barriers in our minds, everything that happened doesn't feel quite real. This era in Europe is already saturated with such atrocity and hate that the invisible Donauschwaben story can be missed amid the deluge of evidence and photographs from the Holocaust. Indeed, little or no physical evidence of the Donauschwaben camps has survived, and so the photos shown here come not from these camps, but from Dachau, one of the largest and worst camps of the Holocaust, which is well preserved and filled with the images of its dark past. And yet, despite all this, there actually exists concerning evidence that certain governments knew what was happening, not after the fact, but as the expulsions were taking place. Of course, the governments of Stalin and of the Balkan states carrying out the expulsions knew, but it seemed plausible, if not likely, that several Allied governments knew as well. Worse, they may have condoned some of what took place, beyond the directive given at the Potsdam Conference for an orderly and humane population transfer. One example of this was a high-ranking Briton in 1947.
Robin Hankey, the Foreign Office Poland specialist and one-time diplomat of the Warsaw Embassy, was one of a number of influential Britons to receive an unsolicited letter in the summer of 1947 from his friend and former Foreign Office colleague Michael Vivian. Enclosed with the letter was a report written by a 26-year-old woman who had arrived in Germany 6 months previously after spending more than 18 months at the Pachulus internment camp in Poland. The account carried the ring of truth and was consistent with many other such testimonies the Western Allies had been receiving about Pachulus and similar establishments. In his response to Vivian, Hankey did not contest the accuracy of anything he had been told, but neither did he think it especially worthy of notice. I agree that the conditions you describe are horrifying. I should have been much more deeply moved if I had not myself been to the extermination camps at Majdanek and Auschwitz, and satisfied myself of the evidence available that the Poles are telling the truth when they allege that about 6 million Jews and Poles were exterminated like flies by the Germans. Having seen myself 800,000 pairs of shoes of people who had been murdered, including the shoes of tiny children of 2 and 3, I cannot work up much sympathy for the poor Germans, much as I condemn the way that they were treated. In the immediate post-war era, such a response was typical. What is remarkable is that in the more than 60 years that have passed since the expulsion of the ethnic Germans concluded, it largely remains so. In both popular and scholarly treatments of the episode in European history, the Holocaust has generally provided the context for discussions of the expulsion, or even for deciding, as in Hankey's case, whether it ought to be discussed at all.
Did you ever try to escape?
We did a few times because a lot of people did. And we tried twice and it didn't work. And so my mother said, now we came that far, being alive, now we're not going to let them shoot us. So we waited out till we had the right papers to leave Yugoslavia and go to see my father.
And as people died off, more were brought in from outside, from other camps that they had retaken. Because quite a few people escaped and went back to their home, and then they were caught again and brought back. And we escaped from Gakova, and we were caught and brought back. And the third camp was Kruševo. It was smaller. It was a camp just for the hard cases, for people like us who knew how to abscond, I guess. And Grandma would sneak out at night. She was fluent in Hungarian, and she'd pick out the Hungarian farms around the camp, and they were always generous to us and gave us things. And then she'd sneak back in and get beat up sometimes for bringing stuff in. But she was able to get word out to our relatives in America, and they sent stuff to that Hungarian farm, and we got money and other things. And eventually we were able to bribe the head honcho to let us out, and he furnished a troop of guards that took us to the Hungarian border, which wasn't far away. And she gave him the money, and they didn't shoot us or anything, they just let us go.
So it took a few more months. And then President Truman was president at that time. And he got wind of it. And some of our people from Austria already came over here to this country. And he got wind of it and put pressure on Tito. Marshal Tito was the president of Yugoslavia. He put pressure on to release everybody. And that's how we got back home to our hometown. And then we tried to find where my father was. My father was in a war, and he was captured by the Americans, and he was in Bavaria. So we united with my father in 1950. And so this is how that started.
After the war. Yeah, I think it was after the war, and they said that we could go home, back home to our houses, and we didn't. We were lucky. So from there, I think, I don't know if it was, I think it was Niederösterreich. That's the lower part of the Austria.
Then it became kind of a normal life for you.
Yeah, well, we were there. Well, my brother and sister, Horst and Helga, were born there, and that was in 47. In 1948, my grandmother, my dad's mom, she was the one that came over here first. And we wanted to go with her, and they closed it up like they did here now, when they said
no more
people coming in. Well, that's what they did. From 48 to 50, no German people were allowed to come over here. So, but then they let us in 50. So that's when we came. Otherwise, we would have come earlier. Probably, I don't know. So.
My mom and dad worked on the farm, and there really was no future there. I mean, we made a living, and that was it. We could have never had our own house or anything. And my aunt, she had relatives over here. So my aunt and uncle and their family, they immigrated to over here. And then 5 years later, we immigrated. We couldn't do it earlier because my grandma, she was a little bit older, and they didn't, but then eventually they let her come too, and we weren't going to leave her behind. So.
Actually, my family, when we came out, my mom and my three brothers, we also wanted to go because my father's three sisters, and a brother were already here. One was in Canada, a sister and a brother in California, and one sister of my dad's was here in Akron. And he also wanted to leave, to better your life, okay? And so we went to the German consul, to the American consul, and this and that. And then they stopped the immigration. They stopped it because the quota was full and they couldn't take anymore. So that's it. So then my folks got a nice apartment and bought their furniture. And so they said, that's it. A year later, a letter came and said, if we want to go, we can. So my folks were then already said, now, should we leave everything now what we got? And, so they decided not to go.
So coming to America, of course, I was sick as a dog on the transatlantic voyage in an old troop transporter. It was called General Langford. And we happened to come through during Lent when it was the worst weather in the North Atlantic. We had 100-foot waves, and if the boat wasn't going up and down, which it was a lot of times, it would go up and then down, and it would go down so far the back end would lift up out of the water and the propellers would boom, 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 like that. Everybody was just sick. I threw up 10 times in one day. I didn't get dehydrated because luckily I found where they kept the Coke machines. And you could get a Coke, but that's why I hate Coke nowadays, because I would drink it and then throw it up. So no Coke products for me at all. And on the voyage over, I think I only had one good meal. They had, when it calmed down, they had vegetable soup, which was kind of spicy. And I was only able to get one bowl, and I wanted more, and there wasn't any more. But the boat didn't only go this way, it also went sideways. They had a movie going, and when the boat goes sideways, all the chairs will go wham! And then when it righted itself up, the chairs would go back. Same with the people had suitcases underneath the bunks. The bunks were military, where you had 2, 4, 6 in a row, like that. And whenever the boat leaned, all the suitcases would go wham, and then back the other way, wham. Put up with that for hours. So if you didn't have good baggage, then stuff would just open up and fly all over the place. My poor mom and sister, they separated the women. They were up front, they were up at the bow, and that was the worst, because that went up and down the most. We were kind of in the middle, so we had it a little better. And I don't know how much weight I lost, but I know I lost weight. So we got to New York Harbor. When we started out in Bremen, the SS United States, that was the flagship of the Atlantic at the time, the fastest ship. It was being loaded, or it just came in to be loaded, and we were leaving. It actually passed us somewhere in the mid-Atlantic, and it was empty and docked already when we got to New York. So our passage was eight days, and the SS United States made it in 5 or 6 days, I don't know which.
And then when I was 19, I met my husband, and he was a coal miner in Germany. He was a true German. He said, "How would it be if we go to America?" I said, "Well, I can ask my aunt." I asked my aunt here. She went to Father Monsignor Wolf at St. Bernard Church. Anybody that came from our people who needed a signature that he has a job and has a place to live, he signed it. So everybody that came through St. Bernard, so to speak, through a German Catholic refuge center, whatever you want to call it. And in 6 months, my husband and I were here. We were not even married yet, and my aunt already had made papers that we were married. So bang, bang, we got married over there, and in no time we were here. So this is how I wound up here. And my brother that's here, the one that's 2 years younger than I am. He came a year before, but he went to California, and then he found out we were here. Then he came and stayed with me till he got married. That's how I got here.
So, and then we came over here and settled here. We actually had a sponsor in Virginia, and but that didn't work out because he said he had a working farm and he didn't have anything really. And so my aunt and uncle came and got us and brought us to Akron. Coming to America was hard. I was 12, didn't know a word of English, and when they tried to enroll me in school, elementary didn't want me, junior high didn't want me because they didn't want to deal with somebody that didn't speak English. And so I started in junior high, but they just kept on passing me through, not knowing the language or anything, you know, so it was very hard. I wouldn't want to do it again. It's no fun being a teenager and not knowing to speak the language and all that, no.
But it was nice to be settled in. Grandma met us at the train station with a friend who had a car. And quite a big car, and I was amazed at the size of it. And it was March, Ash Wednesday actually, is when we arrived. And she had turned down the local TV station. They were going to come and interview us and video us, and she said, no, don't need that. So we weren't on TV, which was okay. So we got to the house, her house, and I learned English by watching TV. I had a half a year English at the German gymnasium, they called it, which was equivalent to our high school. But they start earlier there. After third grade, you have to take a test. If you don't pass it, you don't get to go to high school. You get to go to trade school or technical school or whatever. So I passed it, and we had English and German the same year, and French. So I learned in 6 months. I learned quite a bit, and then I watched TV. Grandma kept us home for 2 weeks, so we would just watch TV and learn language. Then we got to go to Catholic elementary school. It was called St. Joseph's. And the funny thing was, they didn't test us or anything. They just stuck us, believe it or not, I couldn't even fit in the chairs, put us in first grade. Me and my brother, one day. My sister was lagging behind. She stayed in first grade. But us, my brother and I, they put us in first, second day and second, third day and third, and so on, up the ladder. And then fifth, sixth, seventh, eighth grade, got in the math class. That was about the 8th day, I guess. And they were doing math, just the rote math, multiplication, subtraction. And they asked me to go solve a problem on the board, and I didn't work it out. I just put the answer from my head. And then this one kid was kind of jealous. He says, "What kind of math did you do?" So I put an algebra problem on the board, and they go, "Huh?" And they asked the nun, "Is that correct? Does x equal 5?" And she goes, "Yeah, that's it." So one nun had problems with square roots, so I had to go teach her class how to do square roots. So that was a bit of satisfaction. That's what kind of turned me on the path of being an educator, because I enjoyed teaching people math, I guess, or just anything.
Still, expectations for America did not always match reality.
So we got to the immigration, and first thing that really made me aware about the prejudice against anyone from Germany. They looked at all our stuff, and I was allowed to bring my accordion. And it said Hohner on the machine and made in Germany, and that bastard, he ripped off the made in Germany sign. That was the first negative thing I experienced when I got there.
Yeah, no, I was kind of disappointed because in Europe, you know, when I was 11 years old, and they said, "Oh, America," and oh, you know, I thought that was going to be gold or whatever, you know. And we came over here to Ellis Island, and there was nothing. There was a big old building, and we were on the ship. We came with the ship. And we came out and we went into that old building, and then they told us that we had to go on a train, and my dad didn't know, and he wanted some food, and he couldn't get it because he couldn't speak the language at all. But they put us on a train, and then the train brought us here to Akron because my dad's brother lived here. Okay, he was an American
20 years
citizen.
before.
Yeah, they took us to school up here, in Northampton. I was starting the 5th grade in Europe, and when I come over, they put me back in the 5th grade again, so that I finished 5th grade. Yeah. And they were surprised that I was so smart, because in Europe at that time, we did multiplications already, and we did, all kinds of, here in the 5th grade, they didn't at that time. So, they were surprised that I knew all that stuff already.
As the Donauschwaben settled into their new homes, maintaining their heritage remained very important to them. The German Family Society of Akron began in the basement of St. Bernard's Church in Akron, Ohio. It was one of many German clubs in the area at the time of its foundation, and one of many Donauschwaben clubs throughout America. Today, it is the only German club remaining in the area. Still, it and the other Donauschwaben clubs founded throughout the United States and Canada maintain strong bonds.
The German Family Society. Well, there were a lot of people that came over this country around that time, 50 and 51, and through where people worked, my dad worked, and so they would meet sometimes people that also came from Europe, and then a lot of them came through the St. Bernard Church, So they said, Father Wolf said, okay, that we were allowed to come downstairs in the basement and get together, with the other families. And that's how it started, really.
It was called St. Bernard's German Club.
The sponsorship requirement for many of the immigrants, a signature indicating the prospective immigrant had access to a job and housing in America, resulted in highly concentrated pockets of Donauschwaben in certain cities.
There was 6 German clubs in the Akron area, in the South Akron area, where the German clubs were what I grew up with. The GBU, Sons of Hermann, there's an Austrian club, and there was probably
the Freiheit.
The Freiheit is another one, and every one of them went away except for our club. So it's kind of cool. Even the club that we used their facility at the German Berg Club, they just let us use their facility. It was not our club, but we had to give all our profits to them.
Yeah, because at the German American Club, we had the upstairs, which we rented from the club itself, because they had a downstairs with the bar and everything, and the kids were not welcome downstairs or anything, even as teenagers or whatever.
But they wanted nothing to do with young people. They thought they were nothing but trouble, so they were somewhat reluctant to let them use the upstairs. But when we realized how many kids were involved, that started some irritation between the two clubs.
Well, after we were there a few years.
Yeah, because so many kids were. We had huge youth groups and kinder groups back then.
And they were jealous, but they didn't have no aftergrowth. You know, the younger people, they didn't have any younger people anymore.
And they died off.
Yeah, they died out. And
Yeah.
At
one point, it was a bunch of 80-year-olds that were running the place.
Right.
As we were parting ways with them.
Yeah.
And probably another 10 years, it was gone.
From there, that's when we went to Brimfield out there. So, yeah, and the Brimfield thing, that was all woods almost in the back. Mm-hmm. And everybody pitched in. Every day somebody came and we cut the trees down. And, now we have the 3 soccer fields, you know, in the back up there. So
I was 17 when we moved out there.
Yeah.
So I helped too. So in 1973, they bought the property out there in Brimfield. And it was only 10 acres. And that building, the center part of the building, which you walk in, is where we eat upstairs on the upper level, up to the bar, that was the whole building. It's been added on 5 times.
Yeah, it was just a little...
it was a machine shop. It was a machine shop at one time. It was, my whole life was the club.
I joined the youth group when I came over when I was about 14, 15. And my kids grew up in the club, and it couldn't have been a better place to bring up your kids. It's because it's very family oriented and stuff. So the clubs that have young people involved, they're doing good. But there were so many clubs that didn't involve the young people or concentrate on the young people, because in order to survive, you got to have your younger generation in there. And which is always what we counted on, you know, having kids in between youth group, which some of the other clubs didn't do, and so a lot of them have folded. But I think if you concentrate on your younger people, I think you can survive.
Today there are Donauschwaben living in Austria, Germany, the United States, Canada, Australia, and South America. Although they are scattered, many still retain their traditions and connection to one another. Each year, clubs from the United States and Canada gather on Labor Day weekend for the Landesstreffen Festival, which is hosted by a different club each year. There, dance groups perform, and the Donauschwaben from opposite sides of North America have the opportunity to meet one another and create lasting friendships.
I loved growing up in the youth group. I loved the youth group being in there, and I enjoyed having my kids in there and going to the functions every year, Labor Day weekend, meeting all the other people. I think it's a great experience for anybody.
Kirve Fest is a tradition which reaches back to the beginning of the Donauschwaben culture. However, it is still important to the Donauschwaben today, and many clubs still celebrate it.
Well, at the club we have Kirve, which was a holiday. Whenever the church was built, that was a date that was observed every year thereafter. It's called Blessing of the Church. That's Kirve, that's what that means. So it's celebrated every year, and we do it at the club. In fact, it's happening this Sunday. They have a mass and a procession around the lake, and then they choose 2 of the most, I don't know what you would call it, a boy and a girl, Kirve boy and Kirve girl. The 2 that have been the most exemplary personalities, I guess.
Hello. Well, I'm not sure if any of you really know what Kirve is, so welcome to our festival. I'm going to explain to you what our celebration includes. Kirve is a wonderful tradition of the Donauschwabian culture. The Donauschwaben are a German-speaking community who lived in the former Kingdom of Hungary and now cover Hungary, Romania, Croatia, and Serbia. They migrated in large groups from the German areas of Western Europe, taking large boats down the Danube River to southeastern Europe. Because they started in the city of Ulm in Schwaben, and because they sailed on the Danube River, they became known as Donauschwabians, or Donauschwabens. Or if you're just one of us, we call each other Schwabs. The word Kirve is derived from the words Kirche, meaning church, and Weihen, meaning to bless. To honor and thank God, the Donauschwabens built a church in each town and celebrated its blessing each year. These celebrations were known as Kirve. Eventually, the Kirve became the most important annual festival in every village. Today, we celebrate Kirve in remembrance of our ancestors, their trials in traveling down the Danube, and eventually settling in America. We remember their efforts in making a better life for themselves and their families. Most importantly, we celebrate the blessings in our lives today because of their courage and sacrifices.
Rosemary in the life of the Donauschwaben. A small bouquet of rosemary is a symbol of love, faith, and earth. For the Donauschwaben, it is our constant companion throughout the year, throughout our whole life, from the joyous celebration of baptism to the hour of leave-taking from the deceased. The little sprig of rosemary, as a symbolic mark, epitomizes fertility, health, and a life-creating power on special occasions such as christening, wedding, and burial. It is used for the Donauschwaben Today during Kirve celebrations and Swabian balls. Once again, we will now celebrate our own Kirve.
The blue candle ceremony is a much more recent tradition than Kirve, but no less important.
The purpose for the blue candle, some of us that came lost our homeland, and the board of the Landesverband board got together and said it would be a beautiful thing to have a blue candle for all the clubs in the United States and light that candle and whenever they have their Christmas festival, okay? And this is uniting us all, the ones that lost our homeland. That is the purpose of the blue candle. Thank you.
The blue candle ceremony is another way for all the Donauschwaben clubs in the United States to remember those they left behind and remain connected to their heritage and to each other. Another way they maintain this heritage is through dance. Many clubs have dance groups for all ages, from Kindergruppe to Jugendgruppe to the adult Tanzgruppe. These groups continue to perform dances in the style of those danced by their ancestors in Europe.
Well, we didn't get, in Europe, we didn't get together in Yugoslavia like we do here. I mean, you did have dances, but it wasn't, how should I say that? They did have once in a while a get together or something. They had the news guy that came in a street, and he would say the news, and I don't know.
It wasn't just the I mean, if you go back now,
yeah,
and you see how we have groups coming from Hungary as an example. It's the dances specific. The dances, they're none of them are really the same, but the whole concept of how we dance is the same. You know, the way that they split off and do this and then marching around and stuff like that. That's still all. We are a lot more. We have more. We're a lot more in our dances than what they do. If you ever have
Still, in contrast with some more traditional clubs, many clubs have choreographed more fast-paced and exciting dances to perform, while still following the style of the original Donauschwaben.
But the theme's still there.
The reason I don't know, because our Donauschwaben, when we started to get the culture going and to do everything the way culture life, we didn't have the money to pay somebody to put that on a big bell, so to speak. There were millions and millions of our Donauschwaben that are dead because of the war. And we have people, when we left our homeland, we got scattered all over the world. We have them in Brazil, we have them in Australia, we have them in Argentina, we have them every continent on this earth. You will find Donauschwaben. And they're very hard-working people.
Yet the scars of the past continue to weigh on the minds of survivors.
Well, The biggest regret is that I missed a lot of schooling. My schooling is, I educated myself. I'm a self-educator, if you want to say that way. Whatever I know, I taught myself. And that is my biggest issue about the whole situation. That I did not have a childhood, I didn't have a youth. We came to Germany, I was 14. I started to go to work because we were 5 people in the house and everybody needed to work. And that was it.
My grandparents didn't like talking about it that much. So yeah, it's one of those things. It's not the fact of growing up, it's the fact of the war. Whatever happened during or before, you know? My grandfather passed away 2 years ago. He was the only one who spoke of it, and just briefly. So yeah, I don't know much.
Well, whenever I get a chance, I talk about it. But it's hard to reflect on because it was all bad stuff, and your mind tries to erase the bad things. I know I saw hundreds of bodies, but it's blotted out of my mind. I just remember eating when Grandma came in and stole stuff, and she brought it back to camp.
There's still a lot of strange attitudes out there left over from, World War II, I guess, and you're still going to run up against things like that no matter how much time passes by, media influences being what they are. There's still a lot of that going on.
I mean, with time, it's all going to die off. I mean, the Donauschwaben, like I say, she's one of the younger ones, and she's in her 80s. It's kind of important to us that it's remembered, but it is going to fade in time. What concern, I guess sometimes I would say never forget that you don't want to have that ever happen again.
Yet, through the haze of a painful past, the future shines bright for the Donauschwaben and their strong cultural identity. The remaining youth programs are robust and passionate as each new generation of Donauschwaben celebrates and maintains the tradition of their heritage.
Like I say, it's up and down the years, but up and down. It was a very struggle for those people. And then they built cities, they built churches, they built beautiful countries, homes, towns, picture perfect. And then they had to leave that again. They had to leave there. Where they started out immigrating to Yugoslavia, and then they had to leave that, but they had there, and then they settled in Austria or Germany. They left that and came over here. So it was up and down the years. That's what I meant to say.